Okay, let's get started. Okay, so today I'm trying a slightly different format. I'm putting some notes at the top of the page to help kind of guide the discussion. So we're going to start where we kind of left the previous, excuse me, the previous episode about handlers and serving internet responses or serving web responses as it was. So what I've done is I've started the project here by creating a new handler, and it's called index handler. And it's a kind of struct that has a method, serve HTTP. And if we go into the documentation here, we see that types, handler, wait, which package is this? Yeah, this is the right package. Types, handler, handler has a method, serve HTTP, which takes a writer and a request. So to enlist in that interface, we implement serve HTTP, and in this case, we just, as we were doing before, write out some text as a stream of bytes, and that's it. And we set it up to handle anything on the kind of root path using our index handler. And we're going to start our server and listen on port 3030. So if we go ahead and run this, excuse me, and we go to localhost 3030, we see our message. So there's our message. Okay, but that doesn't really look like a web page, right? That it doesn't have webby stuff. So we're going to cover templates on this episode, and the first thing we're going to do is we need a place to store our template when we load it from the file system. So templates are just some boilerplate HTML which we can fill in with values, and we'll start with a simple index template, and it's just going to say hello world, but it's going to wrap it with all the nice HTML-iness to make it look more like a web page. It won't look like a nicely styled web page, but it will look like a web page. So we need to load this template from the templates directory and store it someplace. So we're going to store it here, and we're going to call this variable template, and it's going to be a pointer to an HTTP template or HTML. There we go, template. Template. And it's going to be a type of HTML template. Be very careful, there's also text template, but we want HTML template. So we can look and take a quick look at the docs, and if we go back up to the top, we can see that there is a text template package, and there is an HTML template package, and the one we want is the HTML template package. Okay. So now, how do we load our index handler? So we'll create an index handler, and we'll initialize it with a template. So template. We can now do template parse files, and we pass it a list of file names. And so we're going to pass the path to templates index.html. Now this path that I'm using, um, is relative to where I'm launching where I'm launching the code. So if I wanted to, I could take this project and replace the templates, and it would be fine. The templates aren't built into the application or anything. They are just files in the file system, and we just need to have them in a place relative to this running binary. It could be if, maybe if I had like a folder where I kept all my templates, I'd have some, some directory, app templates. But in this case, they are stored in a folder that is right next to where we're going to run the app. So we're just going to use the relative path into that. Now we have a red squiggly. We have a red squiggly because the parse files returns both a pointer to a template and an error. And a lot of times, if we can't load our templates, there's no point in running our application because we can't do anything where there's nothing to display. So there is a utility function called must. And what this does is simply say, okay, if you try to load the handler and there's an error, like it doesn't exist or the file's not readable or whatever, or it can't be parsed, we're just going to panic out of the application. And that's fine because without our handler, there's no point in running our application. There might be situations where you don't want to do that, but for right now, that is perfectly fine. There's no point in running our application. Now, instead of passing in just a new instance of index handler, we'll pass our initialized handler into this method. Okay, so once again, we're storing the template, a reference to the template right here in our struct. We initialize our struct before we use it. Then we add the handler that we create. And so if we now go to, let's go ahead and stop this and restart it. We now go to our application. Oh, that's weird. Oh, we didn't change the logic. Okay. Now that we have it as a member variable, the template is a member variable, we can simply say ih.template.execute, and we are going to pass an instance of interface. In fact, we're going to pass a nil. No, we can't pass a nil. We have to pass. Oh, we have to pass a writer and some data. And so for the data, we're just going to pass nil. Okay. All right, now let's try it. Okay, there we go. That is looking more like HTML. So we execute the template, passing in no data. Okay, so now now we've got our template set up. Let's go and try to pass some data. So we're going to start by creating a struct. So we'll call this struct index response. And we're going to have a name. And that's going to be a string. Right? Okay. So in our handler, we're going to create an index response. We're going to initialize the name with Bob, right? And we're going to pass that struct into our template. Now, if we do this, we don't see any change, right? So if we do this and we go back and reload our template, we see no change. So now let's go into our template and actually use the data we're passing in. So to use the data, we tell the template that we're going to put some data in here from the data passed in by using a pair of curly brackets and a closing pair of curly brackets. Now we're passing in a struct and it has a field called name. And so we're going to put that there. Now the dot, the initial dot, is saying from the data element that I've given you. So there's no name to the data element. It doesn't have, it's not like data.name. No, it's just assumed that it's the root element, so we want the name field from the root element. So now if we run it, we see, hello, Bob. Okay. Now, it could be that the application, as you're writing it, would get cluttered up with all these, structs to kind of just return one response here, one response there. And in point of fact, you don't want to generate a bunch of these responses just for little one-off usages. Now, I'll submit that when you actually do more complicated applications, you actually will create it, these structs, but in some cases, you don't want to have to define these structs over and over again. So we can use what's called an anonymous struct. Now, we haven't covered anonymous structs, but let's take a look at what an anonymous struct looks like. So an anonymous struct is a struct we define on the fly. Actually, let's put that back here so it looks like it's together again. And we have to define what fields are in the struct. So here we go. So here's our anonymous struct. In fact, let's take this out for now. Actually, let's leave it in. Oops. Okay. So our anonymous struct, we set it up by telling it what fields are in the struct. Now in this case, we just have one name field, which is a string. We could have had other fields like age, isn't it? And certainly we could have had other structs in here as well. We could have had, more data, and maybe we define a struct called my fancy struct. Anyway, long story short, whatever fields you can define in a regular struct, you can define in an anonymous struct. And then we initialize those fields. So we are initializing the name field to be Bob. Okay. If we stop it, and yes, there we go, same thing. So let's make sure it's actually working by changing this to Paul. Oops. Need to stop and restart. There we go. All right. So that is an anonymous struct, and the big reason you'll use anonymous structs is in cases where you need to pass a struct as some data, but you don't necessarily want to create a struct for every instance that you need to pass in a struct for, because that does litter your code with all these types. that you need to maintain. And if the only place you're going to be using the struct is this in this one place, there's no sense in having a separate struct definition that you need to maintain. If you're going to use it in more than one place, you should definitely define a struct. Now, maybe a struct isn't the right thing to pass. Maybe what we want is a map of string to interface. So why a map from string to interface? Well, we could, for example, have different kinds of values. So we could, using this approach, by creating a map of interface strings to interfaces, we can say ir.name equals Alice, ir age equals 45. And if we pass that in, again, we can pass in age, it doesn't matter, we're not using it, but if we pass that in, there we go. Hello, Alice. All right, so those are the three ways we can pass data. We can create a struct, so we can create type index response struct name string and pass that in. We can use an anonymous struct. We can say data equals struct name string Bob, right? Oh, forgot my trailing comma. Or we can use a map. So those are the three different ways we can pass data into our handler. And to use the data, we just go ahead and use the dot syntax. And let's go ahead and create a thing of a thing. So we're going to go ahead and create type, let's call this address and struct. The other reason you might not want to create an anonymous struct is if you've got a very complex structure that you need to deliver. So let's go ahead and say add street string city string zip. I know that's not a complete address, but let's go ahead and call this address. And we're going to go ahead and street 23 Melody Lane, city, wooey, wow, and zip. Okay. All right. Now, how do we use this inside the template? Let's go ahead and go ahead and use it. So we're going to address it by, it is the field called address. So it's off the root object. It's called address. And then within an address, we've got a street field. Now this in this case is a struct, but it could be a map as well. And let's do this. And we've got city and zip. Now, if we go ahead and run this, there, we see our data. Okay, so that's how we can pass complex data elements. But the question is, how do we get this data to our to our server? Well, we need to be able to handle post requests. So here's a simple form. The form is it's a simple post to an action called post form, and it's going to send a name to our application. So let's quickly define our handler. So we're going to call this post handler and post and we're going to just copy this, right? And in this case, our file name is the form and we're going to handle actually let's call this form handler. Okay. And we need, sorry, keep jumping around. We need serve HTTP on the form handler, so in this case we don't have to pass any data to the form handler. If we run this and we go to /form, there's my form where I can submit the name. Now, it didn't do anything. Well, it went back to the index page, but that's just kind of an accident of how some of this stuff works. But long story short, we tried to post something to post form. Post form doesn't exist, but this handler picked it up since post form starts with a /. All right, so now we need to handle that response. So let's define our post handler. We'll call this post handler. And it doesn't have a template, but we will need to define a handler function for it. Okay. Now, what is this going to do? So what we're going to do is from the request, form, get, and our form value name is name. Okay, let's take a look at our form. Our form has one input, and the input's name is, well, name. Okay. So we'll get that value. We'll call this name. So what does get return? Get returns the first value associated with the given key, and it returns an empty string if there's nothing. Okay. So let's go ahead and redirect to. So normally what happens is for a lot of post handlers, we want to say, okay, great, we got some value. We don't necessarily want to render the response in the post handler. We want to actually redirect the person so that they issue a get with that data on a different page, or on the same page but returning a different kind of response. In this case, we'll redirect to our home page. So we will do an HTTP redirect. Redirect will set up a redirect action for us. We need to pass it the writer, the request, the URL we want to go to, which is a slash, and the code we want to use. Now the code is the type of redirect. So in some cases, if you're going for a resource, that resource is permanently moved to another location. In this case, it's a temporary redirect. So I want to do HTTP status temporary redirect. And what we want to do is now when we do the redirect, we're going to just jump into our index handler, and as you can see, we don't actually do anything with that value. So we need to pass the value in some way to our handler. We can pass it using our using a query, an HTTP query, by simply writing it in here. So we can use question mark name equals, and then we can pass in the name, right? Generally speaking, you don't want to do this exactly this way. I'm kind of just illustrating a point here more than anything else. But we could use this to pass it. A lot of times what happens is we get to our post handler and we create something like a record, and what we do is we redirect to a URI that understands that reference for record. But in this case, what we're doing is we're just going to add a query element called name, right? And we're going to pass it the name. So if we go and run this, and we go back to form, so reload our form. Let's say Becky. So if we look up here, oh, still in post form. Oh, we didn't add so now try it. Okay, Becky. We look here. Oh, where did our name go? Looks like we got back the empty string. All right, well, it would have been nice to show you using the value, but let's just do a quick debug. So let's say log println name. Go check our output. Well, it did not get a value for name. I wonder what's going wrong. All right, well, I will have the answer for this conundrum in the next episode. Definitely hitting this handler. Oh, now let's try it. Okay, and we see that we are passing Becky now as the string. I forgot to call parse form to actually initialize the form response that we got back from the in the handler. So you need to call parse form to initialize the form values, and then once you do that, you can use the individual values to get information. Generally speaking, when you're doing some debugging output in handlers, you want to use the log package just to give you some nice, timestamps and separate lines and everything else without worrying about printfs. But yeah, definitely look at using the log package. And our redirect worked, and we could, if we wanted to, pull the data out and use it in our information here. But anyway, long story short, kind of bumpy, but we got a number of handlers installed here for a bunch of endpoints on a web app. And then from here on in, it's just a matter of refining a lot of this stuff and making it work for the app that you want to build. And, I'll cover some other things that might be helpful for building web apps in later videos, but that's it for today. And I will have see you again on Wednesday. Next week, I will be unable, I'll have a conflict and I won't be able to stream. So there will be no streams next week.